people often ask me, what do you think about Japan? And when I was first in Japan, I could give a very quick answer. Now, the longer I stay here, the more difficult some of the answers become. However, when I look at foreign companies doing business here in Japan, that the way in which you handle yourself, the way that you do things, I think is very important. In other words, form is important as well as the content or context. And symbolism is extremely important. And this is something that should not be forgotten. And I look at those foreign companies that are successful and have been successful in Japan. You study them and you figure out, why, how has this happened? They have studied the environment here, the culture very well, and I see what I would call a marriage between the two cultures, between the American or the Western and the Japanese, and it's not just one-sided. And with the Japanese that are working for our foreign companies, I think they expect that.
Hello, I'm Joe Grimes, the president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan. The main objective of the Chamber is to promote commerce between the United States and Japan. That includes both trade and investment. What we do most of the time is to work with the Japanese government and the U.S. government to make market access for American companies, particularly for American exports, easier in the Japanese market. For example, we've been working closely with the Japanese government in the sense that we now have formal negotiating or liaison arrangements with 11 ministries. We meet regularly with the economic advisor to Prime Minister Nakasone, and we are now on many different councils that the various ministries of the Japanese government have set up. We do a great many studies. Most recently, we put out the latest edition of the Trade White Paper last September, a very well done document which is quite influential both in Japan and in Washington. We work very closely with the Japanese government in the implementation of the action program for greater market access for foreign goods and services. The Japanese government rarely now takes a step without coming to us for our comments, and whenever we say anything, they really do listen. In addition to these efforts to open up the market and break down the barriers to trade and investment, the Chamber also tries to help companies make their entry easier into the Japanese market. Even big companies that are coming to Japan for the first time find this difficult, but it's especially true for smaller companies. And one of the big problems that they have is how to recruit the right kinds of people, how to train them, and how to motivate them. When I came to Japan, I was fortunate. I'm the vice president of Honeywell in Japan, and our company, Yamataki Honeywell, has been in existence since 1953. Before that, it was a Japanese company since 1907, the Yamataki Company. Today, we have 5,000 employees with 6 factories around Japan. So for me, it was a little easier. But for many of you who are coming into Japan for the first time, you really do need the kind of help that the Chamber can give you. The Chamber has over 20 committees, and one of the key committees is the Employment Practices Committee. You're going to be seeing a seminar or symposium later on this videotape telling you something about recruiting and motivating Japanese employees. It really is one of the critical elements in Japan. Every country, of course, can say that it's different, and recruitment is going to be different. There are motivations in every country that are different, but it's particularly true in Japan because of the cultural differences. I think you're going to find, when you see this seminar on strategic tools for managing Japanese personnel, that it may be one of the most important television or videotapes that you've ever seen. This, of course, is only one step. It's just an opening for you to learn more about how to handle Japanese employees. Fortunately, there are a lot of consulting firms, both Japanese and American, who can help you to avoid the pitfalls and personnel practices in Japan. The Employment Practices Committee of the American Chamber of Commerce has conducted a number of seminars. These have been excellent ways to teach people how to operate in the Japanese market. I think you will find the one you're about to see extremely interesting. So without further ado, Please enjoy yourselves. Thank you for listening.
Tom is one of the leading experts in labor relations and personnel policies here in Japan, and I think he's provided the linking pin between East and West, writing for American businessmen in terms of Japanese personnel practices, and also writing for Japanese businessmen on American practices, books like Handbook of U.S. Personnel and Labor Relations, The Passport to Japan, and his most recent book, Labor Pains and the Gaijin Boss. In addition to those books, he's also been author of various articles and interview all on the subject of labor relations and personnel. And this morning, he's going to be speaking with us about strategic goals for managing Japanese personnel.
So let's start out. I'd like to start out by, though, giving just an introduction to some of the differences between Japanese and American personnel or labor relations, or some of the differences between management. And I hesitate to spend too much time on this because I think a lot of you know about it, but on the other hand, it is a combined seminar also with the University of Maryland, and I think it's useful to look at some of those perhaps more historical and traditional foundations, as well as getting into the more kind of nuts and boltsy, what can you do with inside your firm type approach, which is really what my mind and energies have been on. But basically, we have the three pillars of Japanese labor relations. You've heard it a million times. You've got your lifetime employment, seniority wages, and enterprise unions. Okay? Really now, lifetime employment is rather a misnomer because we have the tremendous differences between what are done in large firms and what are done in small firms. And for example, the bureaucratized hiring and career paths, taking people in on April 1st, that is something which you'll only have in the large firms. The enterprise union, in fact, in small firms there are no unions at all. The union organization rate in firms with fewer than 30 employees is probably only about 3%, and it's going down. In fact, in general, union organization rates are going down. There are more and more part-timers going into the workforce. And the peak of union organization here was 39%. It's now down to about 28%. In your small firms, they have no ability to recruit from the universities, just as it's more difficult for a small foreign firm to recruit from the university, right? Because the professors won't take them seriously. Neither will the Gakuseika, or the outplacement office at the university. So in fact, they have to hire a man to do a job. They don't have the backing of the banks to keep them financially solvent and so on, to make long-term career plans. They look at how much money they made, they look at how much corporate tax they have to pay. The Hojinzei, the corporate tax is about 60%, so they figure, well, we better hire some more people or we can expand. On the other side of that, they'll have to be able to get rid of those people as well. So your lifetime employment is really something which is not offered by probably 80%. It's not offered to 80% of Japanese employees. Does it even exist in the large firms? That's another question. The traditional retirement age was 55. Now the common most single age is 60. It's beginning to move up. Now, seniority wages, for example, that again, they cannot work by definition in any sort of a small organization. I don't think they can work in a foreign firm either, in a small foreign firm, because by definition you don't have a bureaucratized career path. You don't have people joining a company as freshmen on April 1st and moving up in the ranks of a firm. So that you tend to have to pay a man any time during the year as a mid-career hire. You have to pay him the wage which he will agree to join your firm. And it's very difficult to have salary tables, and let alone to have fixed age service tables within a firm. Certainly, though, there are tremendous advantages with the lifetime employment concept, which is really more a notion of the closed labor market, isn't it? Lifetime employment is not so much a question of loyalty to an employer, blind loyalty, as much as it is a question of lack of options outside. In other words, Mitsui Bussan would never hire someone from Mitsubishi Shoji, right? Or Hitachi would never hire someone from Toshiba. So in that sense, it was really a once-in-a-lifetime shot to get into one of those major employers. You kept your nose clean. In high school, you studied fairly hard. You got good recommendations, passed your exams, got into a good university, and got into a major company. But and the salary levels are much higher, aren't they, in the major firms? There's security, there are benefits, there's an enterprise union which basically protects you. It's basically an appendage of the personnel department. But you're not going to have that in a smaller employer, and certainly, it can't be expected, I don't think, in a small foreign corporate employer here as well. Some of the advantage of a closed labor market, however, though, are that once you can get the employees in there and you train them, and if you provide training to them and they grow within the organization, ideally they're basically yours. There's less tendency to leave, but that, of course, now is also breaking up significantly, and it's easier to recruit people from other firms. I think what I'd like to do today, beyond that sort of a brief introduction, and we can ask questions about that, is to divide the session up into a number of different segments. And first of all, I'd like to talk about more about recruiting and the employment relationship, or the role of the contract here. Then I'd like to move on and talk about compensation and benefits, and then rules of employment, and then basically problem employee solutions or termination. Okay, in other words, you have to get good people, keep them, and you have to be able to move the bad people out, or at least motivate them and keep them scurrying, keep them moving, working hard for you. Then I'd like to move on to massive staff reductions and cost-saving programs, and then into basically union relations or staff relations, how to maintain control, or how to basically continue to be able to manage, without a union, the union-free environment notion, or to have the right union. Basically, when it comes to recruitment, one of your basic decisions is, are we going to recruit from the universities, or are we going to be able to do that? And you should keep one thing in mind. Although it's a goal to recruit from Japanese universities, and we talk about that, getting the new employees to come in on April 1st, in reality, will you be able to do that? Will you be successful in cultivating relationships with professors? Will the university outplacement people take you seriously and introduce their best students to you? Now, obviously, if you have a very small, if you're a major multinational with a plan to become large in Japan and to build factories and technical centers and so on, if you go to the university before you're in that position and before you've built up that kind of a business, you're really giving the wrong first impression, aren't you? So it's almost better not to do that. You should almost wait until you've got really something to brag about, because you can give the wrong first impression there. And the other side of it is that it doesn't do you much good to take in an inferior student. If you're not getting the best students, and if you also believe that you have to follow the notion of lifetime employment and keep them there, and you can't easily dismiss them, then the problem is you're stuck with a bit of a dreg for life, aren't you? I'm going to take off my jacket. It's a bit hot here with the lights and all. Great. Excuse me. Now, when it comes to recruiting, obviously, what do we have? We have newspapers, newspaper advertising. That's something that should always be tried, especially if a client believes that it may work. It should be tried. You've got to keep in mind, though, that people that are really happy with their job, that are productive, obviously they won't be looking at newspapers, right? Now, it's possible that you can luck out and you can get someone very good, but you have to be careful. When someone comes to you on that basis, he may be rather desperate. In other words, he needs a job. He's out of employment. So even if he's not confident that he can fill that job with you, he may decide to take it. And that's not really a good thing. The other thing you should keep in mind is that people are very successful in jobs when they move for positive reasons. In other words, they did a good job in their other company, and perhaps they happen to be scouted, or you happen to know the man and you talked to him and you planted the seed in his mind. But for negative reasons, in other words, they didn't do so well where they are, or they're not happy with their boss, they're not a member of the inner circle, that then, it's questionable whether the man will be successful when he moves into the new job because he's not working with the proper momentum. Now, so you've tried newspaper ads, you've screened people, and you've got to be, obviously with newspaper ads, when those people come in, they're not passive candidates, they're more eager to work for you. But there's a big difference when you go out and if you try and recruit and use an executive search firm. And let me just get a glass of water over here, sorry. Yeah, thanks. So keep in mind, you know, for example, like in the selection of your executive search firm, you want to look for a firm which has the confidence to really build you up and fill all your assignments. In other words, the most easily identifiable people are the more senior managers. In fact, they are even written in directories and so on. Because you're the employer, you can't call them directly and you don't want to do that, but they're rather easy assignments. But what will make you successful in Japan will be to work with a firm that can really get not only your top managers, but build your organization all the way down through. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that with a good firm that will has the ability and has the manpower to fill in your mid-manager and lower manager positions, as well as even engineers and so on. If you don't give them your largest assignments, obviously they won't work as hard for you. And so you should pick someone who can do the easy ones. They're not as hard. It takes longer and the decision takes longer, but you need someone who can staff all the way through the company. And also then we have the question of how to treat the employee when he gets in and the relationship of the contract in Japan. Basically in Japan, and if an employee has no contract, that's when he's considered to be the seishain, or the regular employee. And as soon as an employee is on a term contract, essentially he's lost his so-called lifetime employment, or his ability to potentially litigate against you if he's on a term contract. Now there is talk about if the contract is renewed a number of times, it's not as easy to get rid of the man. There's some truth in that, but the point is the expectations are very important, and you know, any potential judge would also see it that way. So when you're recruiting here, basically, if you have a question about a man or it's a very important position, it might make sense to even put him on a one-year probationary period. And I would suggest that if a candidate is not willing to take a one-year probationary period, there may be a reason for that. If he's got a very good job now, yeah, sure. Why should he take the risk? Other considerations in recruiting are, for example, secondment or employee loans. But you have to be careful because generally joint venture partners won't give you their best people. And particularly also in the banking area with correspondent banks, there's a tendency to bring employees in and to take loans. And often they're second or even third grade people. There are other questions that you have. For example, if you make a man if you offer him a directorship, Torishimariaku status, that means essentially a two-year term there. And directors are no longer covered by the labor standards law. So again, one advantage is that if he doesn't work out, it is possible not to renew the contract. But it also is a very important tool in recruiting somebody, and perhaps even at a lower salary, you should be able to bring in a good man. We also have the notion of how attractive you are. You're dealing with passive candidates if you're trying to build up your workforce here. So if you have, for example, factories and so on, there's less risk and it's more attractive to the candidate, and it's more possible that you can bring in the same man at even a lower salary. So there can be hidden savings actually in building up an operation here. And although a factory may cost quite a lot of money, rather than lease the land, if you buy the land and if you make that a selling factor, it's possible to bring in probably better people at a lower cost. Another factor you might want to keep in mind is when recruiting, it's important, I think, to have an expatriate manager in your operation here, or at least to have someone who's on a different career path than the Japanese managers, because he's a good person to deal with and to make sure that top quality people are brought into the organization. Sometimes when such a man is not there, there's a tendency to try and keep control, and it's better to have a check and to have someone who'll go back to the head office at some point. So he'll be more objective